Thanks so much, Stu. It's great to be here. It's really exciting to hear about a climate incubator right here in New Haven. That's really, really exciting news. It's going to be great for future generations of students and other folks, I'm sure. Well, thank you all for being here so early on a Friday. My name is Max. I'm a second-year student at the School of Management, exploring all things clean energy and climate while I'm here in school. It's been a great experience so far. I am really excited to be introducing and moderating our first panel of the day with four great panelists. The panel is called New Business Models for New Technologies, and what I think we're going to be spending our time talking about is sort of, kind of what is a business model. Fundamentally, it's a way that kind of businesses sort of take something and put it into action, take an idea and try to execute it. And so I think we're going to spend our time talking about is sort of what it takes to sort of turn words into actions in a climate context to sort of make progress on all sorts of decarbonization goals. And I'm really excited to be joined by four panelists, all doing different types of really important work in the space. First up, our first panelist, Sara Harari, is the Associate Director of Innovation and Strategic Advisor to the President and CEO of the Connecticut Green Bank. Very important organization, lots of connections here in New Haven. Sara designs new programs to deploy green infrastructure throughout the state. She also serves as the co-chair of the Connecticut Innovation Advisory Council, the co-chair of the Connecticut Hydrogen Task Force, and is an advisory board member to the Connecticut Hydrogen and Electric Automobile Purchase Rebate. Our second panelist joining us virtually is Becky Gallagher. Becky is currently the Director of Offshore Wind New Business at Avangrid. She's focused on a just and clean energy transition. Her team runs market making, lease auctions, state RFP responses, PPA contract negotiations for a whole bunch of offshore wind, which is a really sort of exciting developing market right here in the Northeast. Our third panelist, Mothusi Pahl from Modern Electron. He leads business development, product management, and government affairs for Modern Electron, a Bill Gates-backed heat and hydrogen company based in Seattle, Washington. Mothusi has a deep background in energy technologies, infrastructure, early-stage startups, an extensive career across private equity, startups, industry. Really excited to have him on the panel. And finally, last but not least, Jake Seligman is a leading renewable energy lawyer. He works on a whole bunch of renewable energy project finance, M&A and development transactions with Clearway, utility-scale renewable developer. Been doing that work for many years, focusing largely on utility-scale solar and wind projects. So I'd love to invite our three panelists up to the stage, and we'll get started. Great. So to start, I'd love to give each of our panelists sort of an opportunity to talk a little bit about sort of the organization and their work, sort of what they focus on, and what sort of makes a kind of an attractive or compelling business model. So Sara, starting with you first at the Green Bank, can you tell us a little bit about sort of at a high level, sort of what's the Green Bank's sort of role, philosophy? What do you look for? And when you're sort of looking, thinking about, assets, companies, sort of, so your role as a lender, sort of, what are you looking for? What stands out to you? What makes an opportunity attractive?
Sure. So I feel like Stu sort of stole my thunder this morning when he hyped up the Green Bank. But the Green Bank is a quasi-governmental state agency here in Connecticut. We started in 2011. Our philosophy is basically let's look at the market and see where it's being underserved by the private market. What technologies aren't people adopting because they can't get a loan to do it? What customers aren't developers going after because they don't view them as a good investment option? And really identifying how we can use public capital to drive change in those places. And since we started in 2011, we have mobilized investment of $2.5 billion of investment in the Connecticut green economy. And we do that by leveraging limited public funds to attract private. So we are investing at a ratio of about $1 public dollar to $7 of private right now. So we go out, we say, look banks, look customers, this is actually much less risky than you thought it was going to be. And we will put our money where our mouth is. So even though some of the primary loans are going out through our local credit agencies, they are assured that if customers default on the loan, that the state is actually going to be the one that bears the outsized portion of the risk. And we do that in a way that's not taking technology risk. We're not looking to fund the next great widget. What we're looking for is, where has the technology risk been retired, and where is the market not seeing that? How can we make sure that these great ideas that are proven and technologically viable but not yet adopted by the market, how can we be part of that solution and train banks to lend to those projects, to train customers to view those as viable and solutions for them? We work most of the loans that we work on and most of the projects are focused on home and business owners in the state. So we're figuring out, like, if you want to put battery storage in your home right now, or 10 years ago, if you were trying to do rooftop solar and you went to your bank, you said, I need a loan of $15,000 to do this project, they would look at you and say, why? Why should we fund that for you? Where is the savings going to come? Why should we feel confident that there will be, that you will pay us back on this loan? And so it's our role to help create those markets. And in my position as the director of innovation, I am looking forward. So I'm saying 2 years from now, 5 years from now, what are the opportunities that the Green Bank will be ready to finance and invest in? And how can we make sure that when we get to those points, those technologies are proven, we understand what the marketplace and the stakeholders are, and how can we be ready when we get there to make those loans and opportunities?
That's great. Thanks, Sarah. So Jake, jumping to you, sort of different business, different type of technology, maybe not so new in some ways, but maybe new in other ways. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of when you're looking at utility scale wind and solar projects for development or acquisition, what are you thinking about? What makes the project attractive for Clearway? And sort of how has that changed over time, or how might that change moving forward in the coming years?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Great to be here. And just a little bit about Clearway. We're one of the larger renewable energy developers in the country. We do utility scale wind, solar, storage, and potentially hydrogen too. I've never felt so boring, but we're this industry, seeing all the great things that are going on in climate tech and all of that. 10 years ago when I started in this business, being a renewable energy developer was not an very well established thing. And so we are in the business of putting steel in the ground. And so we are trying to, our pipeline is about 30 gigawatts right now. And every year we try to put in service 2 to 3 gigawatts of carbon-free generation on the grid. So we look for good projects, and our main, what defines that is often based on, what we can, what the financing markets are have an appetite for. So we are trying to build clean, not hairy projects, which is very difficult. Starting from land through interconnection, through energy procurement, equipment procurement, and then through financing. And so ultimately projects, the financing for projects comes from very low cost of capital providers like pension funds and what have you. And so we're trying to de-risk projects throughout their whole life, and that's kind of the name of the game for us. And we, with the passage of the IRA, which I'm happy to talk more about, we for the first time in maybe the life of the renewable energy industry, have some policy stability. And so it's really a time for executing and putting steel in the ground and bringing in new technologies along the way.
That's great. Yeah, we'll definitely touch on the Inflation Reduction Act and Bill and IRA, as Ali called them last night. in a bit, but that's great. Thanks, Jake. Becky, are you on the line? Can you hear us? Stu is gesturing at me, but I'm not sure what that means. Okay, we'll move on to Mothusi. So coming from a different type of organization, more of a startup, focusing on a different sort of decarbonization solution, can you tell us a little bit about sort of what Modern Electron is trying to do in the hydrogen space, and sort of the technology you're working on, how that's different from other folks in the hydrogen game, and sort of what your sort of comparative advantage might be, to use the economics term.
So as the preface to that, if you think about the clean tech space and technology space as a spectrum, Sarah and Jake are in the fully formed, mature, you mentioned what's the next great widget, and not looking for tech risk. I'm on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, and I'm right at the maker space, transitioning into let's get money behind an early project to start doing the technical de-risking. So in the best case scenario, where I sit probably ends up being 5 years out from the scale and reliability that Green Bank would be looking for, and is probably a decade out from what you would normally see for a developer backable project. I don't want to say that it's going to take us 10 years to get there. We're going faster than that. But so we are really we're working at the core of heat. And most folks globally, and even most people in the energy community, don't appreciate that over half of the energy that we as a society use is in heat. Electricity is sexy because we can see it, and it gives us the convenience of our computers and our chargeable cars. But heat for industrial processes, for commercial space heating, for hot water at a restaurant, or fire to roast coffee. I mean, heat is everywhere. We just don't see it. So all of our work is around trying to decarbonize heat, and the real rate limiting step there is if we work on the understanding that over half of the energy that we consume is heat, and the vast majority of that heat is coming from natural gas, and that our electricity grid as it currently stands is already taxed, both in terms of power generation capacity and transmission and distribution capacity, logically, you can see that there's no way on earth that we could today, or within kind of like the foreseeable future of the next kind of decade or two, be able to transition all of that heat to our electrical grid. It's technically possible, but based on our society's interest in spending and infrastructure, I mean, it's not going to happen. So the question is, how do you decarbonize that heat? And our hypothesis is the fastest, easiest, lowest cost way to do that is through hydrogen. Moreover, our argument is that for all of the focus on hydrogen around carbon intensity and cost of production, that if you actually go into the numbers, 2 to 3 times the cost of production is what you should allocate for in actually getting hydrogen to the point of use, because the infrastructure isn't there. So what's the easiest way to get hydrogen there? Methane has 4 atoms of hydrogen in it, and if you can figure out a clean way to and cost-effective and efficient way to crack methane, if that infrastructure is already there, then you've really de-risked that business model because you don't have to worry about infrastructure. So our technology is really oriented around clean. It's called pyrolysis. It's clean pyrolysis, and we're able to drive a clean process because we're not using electricity to generate the heat to drive the process, and we're not burning methane and creating a massive CO2 footprint for our process. I can go into it a little bit more, but just in terms of business model, a lot of the work that we do is around trying to figure out how to tackle markets that don't really have experience or interest in taking on energy risk. And that's work in progress.
Great. Let me ask a quick follow-up as someone who's very much not a scientist, doesn't come from a technical science background. My understanding of modern electrons, of your process, is that the real problem you're trying to solve is that it's difficult, it's expensive to sort of transport and store H2, the gas, and so you use sort of the existing natural gas infrastructure that gas utilities, other companies have to transport natural gas, right? Just largely methane, CH4. You sort of split that out at the end use, where the fuel is being consumed, so you can use the clean fuel instead of the dirty fuel. So what happens to the carbon when you split that out? Those like on a molecular level, like what happens to what's the carbon byproduct? What do you guys do with it?
So you made a really good summary there. Imagine a box that sits at your gas meter that rips the carbon out of CH4 and delivers hydrogen at the point of use. So the reason we don't need infrastructure is because we're not transporting purified hydrogen anywhere. Mm-hmm. Our output is solid carbon. In its natural state out of our system, it comes out, it's like the texture of powdered sugar and it's jet black. We are working on 3 or 4 different application spaces for sequestering carbon at scale. One is agricultural in nature. One is actually trying to figure out how to get it into asphalt, so for roads and building materials. And the third is just straight burying it in the ground. The interesting thing is people raise a lot of money for businesses to sequester carbon dioxide. CO2 sequestration is sexy and sounds really ambitious and cool, but when you tell people, oh, we're going to bury carbon in the ground, all of a sudden they get really, really defensive. But if you think about the logistics and cost of sequestering carbon, solid carbon, that in its natural state wants to sit on the ground or sit in the hole where you buried it, versus CO2 that requires compression, which has its own footprint, and piping to an old wellhead where you would inject it in the ground. Just the economics and logistics of doing that is way more complicated than managing solid carbon. So yeah, we see various iterations of locking it into the ground.
Got it. Interesting. That's helpful. Cool. So kind of pivoting now to sort of more of an open dialogue between our panelists. So let me sort of pose a question to any of you three, all of you three, and then we'd love to sort of hear sort of responses and reactions to it. So in each of your different lines of work, either your own organization or other organizations and companies that you work with, what's sort of some of the biggest risks or impediments to progress, to more development, more deployment, more progress on any sort of decarbonization front, and what either can your organization do, can any of us do, can sort of society do to sort of help get past that hurdle? What are kind of like the obstacles, and what can we do to overcome them?
I know Jake's going to say, he's going to say interconnection.
Aside from interconnection,
that's a big one.
That is a big one. Yeah, the grid is challenged, and it cannot, without reforms, which are happening, slowly, handle all the generation that's going to come online over the next 10 years. It's also been an interesting year for challenges because I think solar installations are down 25% year over year, which is really counterintuitive if you're looking at the general trend towards deployment.
You know why that is?
Yeah, and so what happened was supply chain, and COVID impacted supply chains, and so shoring up supply chains is going to be a huge need, and it's going to be part of one of the one of the outcomes of the IRA over the next 10 years is onshoring manufacturing of components in all kinds of clean technologies. And the other thing is honestly, that's in that caused that slowdown was bad policy. There was a case at the Commerce Department, a trade case that caused all shipments from China of solar panels to stop for a matter of months. And so that could be avoided and was ultimately fixed by the Biden administration, but it took a while and everything freezed in the meantime. So policy, not just in what Congress puts out, but it coordinated through the administration, through administrative agencies, is also at the federal level very important.
I think for us, when we talk about the transition in the green economy, we want it to happen quickly, we want it to happen equitably, we want it to happen cheaply, and we want it to happen reliably. And hitting all four of those is just an optimization problem that's very challenging, especially when we are working with homeowners and business owners who are looking for equivalent solutions to what they have now, at the equivalent prices to what they are paying now. And the reality is that the solutions can be cleaner, they can be cheaper, they can be more reliable, but they're not necessarily all of those things.
Yeah.
And so, how can we either persuade people that they want something different, or how can we subsidize their transition? To me, one of the big things that I think about is the entirety of the history of electricity generation in the United States has been consumption following. And we want to make sure that every time you turn the light switch, there is power available there for you at cheap electricity prices. But as we start to transition to wind and solar, and we have more intermittent renewables that are coming on, do we need to start to change consumption patterns to be more generation following? And, how do you persuade people to start to think in that way?
What does that look like? Can you sort of talk about that tangibly? What would it mean to sort of have a system where electricity consumption is sort of more generation following, and who might that affect? Where is that realistic?
I think it's a question about how quickly we want to make that transition, because we have programs that are starting to take those steps. Transitioning from a rate perspective onto time of use rates is a great first step. The way that looks like right now is that for 6 hours a day, it's slightly more expensive for you to use power. That's not really enough for anybody except an energy geek to switch their behavior. But we're coming up with tools that can help remove that burden on the customer. The Green Bank is running this storage incentive program right now. We launched it this January. It's called Energy Storage Solutions. It is essentially the next step in a demand response program. Not only are we using the batteries to do grid balancing for the customer and for the load, we are also paying for them, and we are going beyond customer load. So you're actually discharging from the customer battery back to the grid rather than just reducing the power that the end user is consuming. So you can start to take on some of these kinds of projects. The question is is that going to get us far enough? Sure. Or is this at least the first step in training the consumer to think in this way, that you are part of a system, you are not just the end user? And then I think how you do it equitably is also another topic that we can get into.
There are two things that I would like to tack onto that, and particularly as it relates to regulatory and IRA. From the technology side of the spectrum, one of our challenges is that on the front end, these projects all start very, very small. They start at prototype and pilot and demonstration project scale. And before you can start kind of unpacking federal incentives or big projects or big federal policy questions, we've got regulatory stuff at federal, state, county, local. We have literally projects for transactions that we've sold and booked with local gas utilities where we get backed up in terms of timeline by 3 to 4 months because of the local fire marshal.
Oh, yeah.
So you have world-class innovation to try to accelerate through this kind of decarbonization hurdle, and the U.S.'s kind of rabbit warren of regulation and policy is such that it's really, really hard to wade through that in a timely fashion. So you can have the best incentive program that comes out. And what IRA offers for the scale of what a new technology startup's pilot or demonstration project is, doesn't really help for the costs that we have. And secondly, it's going to take us a year to get through one project's permitting just at the local level to break ground. So we have issues that are a lot more granular that we've got to wade through.
Yeah, and as a anecdotal evidence of that, most of the work that I do is in red states, and which is also really encouraging. And I like to tell people that because if you read the headlines about clean energy, it's so politicized, but it's actually not what's happening out in the country. In places, we have the easiest time developing wind and solar projects, for the most part, in places that are used to extraction and don't have a ton of restrictions or NIMBYism, and so which is why Texas is the second largest renewable energy state, and we're doing good work in Wyoming and Idaho and states with a lot of space, but that are also pretty red. And so I'd also wanted to just respond to that on the storage and generation following point, that like another anecdotal piece there is that the grid in California, California has this famous duck curve. I don't know how many of you are familiar with, but like because of the amount of solar generation that comes online, prices at that time of day go negative. And people have talked about, storage smoothing that out, which it is doing. But this summer, California was facing potential for rolling blackouts across the state and was actually saved by storage. All the storage came online and deployed, and California avoided blackouts. And so I'm a believer in that you don't necessarily have to ask people to change their behavior. That's a hard path to walk. And so there's a lot of innovation to be done in I think, smart grid, which we've been talking about for years, but to make that sort of load shifting process automatic, so that people don't have to think about it. But it is also just anecdotally, that there's good news out there, that the storage that is going on to the grid right now has already proven itself in California. And I would note too that we are, we don't, for the most part, I think we're maybe the largest renewable energy developer in California. We're not building solar projects in California without batteries right now. So this stuff is just those two threads. These things are happening, and they're happening out there, and it's in spite of what the sort of headlines are about politicization. It's not. It is local. Like politics are local.
Let me follow up there. I live in Oakland, and the governor's office.
Did you get the text message?
The governor's office sent out texts this summer to please turn off the loads in your house. So, like, my wife literally turned off the dryer, and
it worked.
The message we got in California was not that it was because of storage. Yeah. It was because everybody responded to the text from the governor's office.
Yeah.
I would totally agree with you about the red state piece. But from the business development perspective at Modern Electron, we see the same thing, but the uptake in red state markets is not because it's pitched as decarbonization. It's a profit opportunity. California will jump on board because of the carbon intensity score. Texas will jump on board because of the price.
I think that the local permitting is such an interesting question. We're working on last year in Connecticut, they passed the Clean Air Act that said that by 2030, 100% of the environmental justice school districts in Connecticut have to have clean buses. By 2040, all school districts. And we're like, okay, what does that mean? How do we get there? And so we're starting to think about okay, what does an electric school bus look like? What does a hydrogen school bus look like? What do we need to get school children safely to school? And even though per mile traveled, it is a safe technology, the visibility of some of the things that have gone wrong in the electric transit industry have meant that one of the biggest voices in the discussion is the fire marshals in the safety office saying, like, is this a safe technology? How do we do this safely? And I think that it's a good conversation to have when you're talking about kids on buses, but also, like, how do you have that conversation in a way that's like, yes, this is a danger. How do we manage against this risk? How do you make this transition? Because it is much better on a per student, per mile traveled basis than students breathing diesel gas fumes in the bus. And so, how do you have those discussions at the same time? It can be a very, like, school district by school district conversation to have.
So we have industrial operator customer in the Midwest who was all for running a furnace decarbonization project, and then somebody popped up with the question of, do you have ISO certification? And we're like, oh my God, ISO, that's like a 2-year approval process. And then you have other people asking for UL certification.
Right.
And then you've got, a county engineer who comes out to do a site visit. And I mean, the burdens that come on for all of the safety and engineering and electrical and air quality, it's all really, really important, but I can't imagine. I was up at Greentown Labs yesterday, and just seeing all the work that's happening and thinking how many of these aren't even going to come close to market,
right,
because the front-end permitting piece hasn't been resolved. The founding team runs out of money, and if the respective regulatory authorities could actually understand that the same technology development path over time, that there probably needs to be a permitting path that's achieved over time, rather than front-loading all of the emissions, all of the safety, all of the electrical, all of the fire. The operating model, I mean, this is to me, one of the things that's really exciting about what you guys are talking about doing here in New Haven and for state of Connecticut, is that you have a compact, dense enough operating space where maybe you can get all of these interested stakeholders to pull in the same direction, rather than like California or at the federal level where everybody's pulling in different
I feel like we
directions.
should talk afterwards about the actions that we're taking at the Innovation Advisory Council. It's a really cool program.
That's great. So yeah, let's talk a little more about policy. And I think any business model in the energy and the climate space is going to be heavily influenced by policy at the federal level, at the state level, at local levels too sometimes. So Jake, let's toss it back over to you. Let's talk about the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act first. What changes have you seen thus far with Clearway's business, thanks to sort of IRA provisions? How might you expect that, and sort of what changes might you expect moving forward, or what sort of opportunities might IRA open up that otherwise would have been not so possible?
Yeah, there's so much, and if I were a business school student right now trying to get into clean energy, like, it is really a wonderful moment in time where things are wide open. But for us in particular, I think first things that are happening are, one key feature of the bill is 10 plus year runway of the investment tax credit and production tax credits that renewable energy projects benefit from. We've never had that kind of stability before. The credits have always been kind of like, will they come on? Won't they come on? Will they get shifted down? And so stability is huge, but there are also bonuses that got put in, so you can get more of the credit than you used to be able to for key areas. So one of which being developing projects in energy communities, which are defined as basically places where coal or oil and gas jobs disappeared. And so there is right now a run on development sites in those kinds of areas, like already happening, which is awesome. There's also an adder for using domestic content in your project, so not importing solar panels or wind turbines. And so people are already trying to figure out how to onshore supply chains. And so there's going to be a whole, and not to mention the advanced manufacturing credits that they've added, where there's going to be incentives to manufacture these all components of renewable energy and storage projects and hydrogen projects. There's also hydrogen, which there's new incentives for green hydrogen, which is going to open up that space, I think, that has always hasn't really jump-started, and it's going to jump-start that. There's a lot more too, but there's also, we have to, the industry has to pay prevailing wage and hire apprentices when building projects, which is a new feature that's going to create really good jobs. So there's a lot of opportunity for developers, but also for innovators. And I know that some of the things you all focus on, and for environmental justice, which is something I know, Sarah, you've focused on too.
Yeah. Just a quick note. I want to reserve 10 minutes at the end for some audience questions. So be thinking about questions to ask any of our panelists. But Mothusi, I wanted to ask you. So also a policy question, but I want to talk about bill for a second, not IRA. My understanding is that the bipartisan infrastructure law had a lot in there for hydrogen. The DOE sort of earmarked. I think it was almost $10 billion for the creation of these sort of hydrogen hubs in different regions of the country. Curious as someone working in hydrogen, curious as sort of your thoughts on that, how that maybe affects modern or doesn't affect modern, but sort of where you guys see yourself in that ecosystem, how helpful you think that those initiatives might be. I'm curious to your thoughts on that.
It's good. It's not enough.
Okay.
And the money's going in the wrong places. You want more than that?
Yeah, please. Definitely.
Just the idea of a hub, we think doesn't get to the core of the problem. That you end up having all of these great green centralized hydrogen generation facilities, but how does that hydrogen get to market? It goes in a diesel truck. And you're generating that hydrogen. I mean, how much of today's electrical grid is renewables? I mean, it's 10%, maybe 20% in some markets.
Depends on where you are.
Yeah. 15. Yeah, 20, yeah.
Okay, so let's take that midpoint 15%. That means that 85% of the electricity is coming from natural gas and coal, and that's what's powering your green hydrogen facility that's pulling power off the grid. And then you put it into a diesel truck. So I think hydrogen, the money that's going into Hydrogen Hub is a great start, and it gets people thinking about what this could be and needs to be. But we still run into this rate limiting step of that last mile of how do you get it to the end user. And a lot of that money, just like 45Q type money, is going to oil and gas companies because they're the ones that have the legacy hydrogen generation infrastructure at a lot of their refineries. So the takeaway is that I think it scratches the surface, and I'm glad that it starts the conversation. But for those of us who are really deep in it, you're like, yeah, whoever wrote this, they knew what what good intent was, but actually, in terms of operationalizing it, it's not moving at the speed or necessarily getting to the people who need it the most.
So if the DOE put you in charge and you had sort of $10 billion, let's say, to sort of build out a clean hydrogen infrastructure in the U.S. domestically, how would you spend that money? What would you do with it?
On modern electron. Done. Next project. I think that at early stage startup phase, everything comes down to time. Mm-hmm. And really the questions are, how can you deploy this fastest to the greatest greatest impact?
Sure.
And there's so little structure in place around how these regional hubs form and scale and share information and put projects together. It was really left at the discretion of these regional committees that were total ad hoc formed. There's a really great podcast called CO2 Now out of Colorado, and the gentleman who runs the project also became the central point for Colorado's hydrogen hub, not because he was formally appointed to be that person, but because he had the podcast and everybody in Colorado was calling him about what to do for Hydrogen Hub. So every other week we get on a call and probably have 20 other people on there. But that's how, you have this big giant federal program with a bunch of money to be allocated, but how it gets executed on the ground, it's really been bootstrapped.
Yeah, and I think, Sarah, I imagine you have some thoughts on sort of that last piece there, sort of how, when sort of new sweeping federal policy comes in, how that affects sort of situation on the ground, how maybe that affects existing state policies that are already sort of in play, that are already active. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, for sure. So in both those laws, I think the hydrogen's it's really interesting to hear the hydrogen from your perspective, because I think that from the state perspective, we were like, oh yeah, hydrogen. Okay, we're gonna get experience in hydrogen so that we can make sure that we're making the right choices here. And I think that overall, both of these giant federal legislation bills have sort of had that effect. Right after IRA passed, we were on a call with other states who had signed the We're Still In pledge a few years back, Clean Energy States Alliance, and we heard from one of their employees, this is a chance for you guys to rethink everything. And we definitely viewed it as this is turbocharged for our programs. This is going to be money that's going to allow us to amplify our impact. But the further we get into it, the more I think that staff member was correct. Because it's not just money for our existing programs. It's really giving us the chance to step back and think, how did those programs get to the program that they are now? It was a factor of the people that were involved and the stakeholders that were involved and the incentive programs that we could get past that session. And maybe this is a chance for us to be okay, there's a lot of money coming. How do we make sure that we are doing this in the best way holistically? And, I think in particular on the federal programs, it's really interesting to see the impacts about where it hits the ground. Something we were talking about before we came up here is the Connecticut definition of what an environmental justice and underserved community is different from the federal definition of what an environmental justice and underserved community is. And so we cannot just take those federal funds and plug them into our programs. We actually need to go back and redo all of our definitions so that they qualify for these federal programs, which is not just a plug and play, let's hit the ground running. It's a good thing. Their definitions are a little bit broader than ours, so more people will qualify for those programs now in Connecticut. But it's definitely not just the money is there, go forth and conquer. And it's not just a one-to-one match to our programs. There's just so many different projects and programs. The Green Bank has decided that our focus for right now is going to be the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that I understood got mentioned last night. It's $27 billion that's going to be acting like a federal green bank. It's, modeled very similarly to the Connecticut Green Bank about how can we take money and put it into a recyclable process to continuously fund new projects in the economy. So that one's okay, clearly in our wheelhouse, but we're doing this battery program. Should we also be participating in the DOE RFI about, battery end-of-life recycling? Maybe, where do you draw the line about who should be participating in which program?
Yeah.
So all of it's great.
No,
So,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So before we move into some audience questions, I wanted to give sort of the three of you the chance to sort of make a closing statement of sorts. Feel free to take this in any direction you want, but I guess I'll prompt you by asking. So for folks in the audience, students, professionals, faculty, whomever, what's sort of the one takeaway that you'd want folks to have from either the panel, the conference, from work that you do, from the mission of your organization? What's sort of the one thing? We'll start from Jake and move down this way. What's sort of the one thing that you want people to kind of go home and keep thinking about?
One thing I'm thinking about is I never felt that renewable energy development was boring, and I want people to take that away. That which is, and I can explain. When I was here in 2012 as a student, I went to the Yale Energy Conference, and I think it was at the law school, and the whole conference was about the future of natural gas. It was someone from Shell talking about to the room, and there wasn't a word about renewables or climate or anything like that. And that was not that long ago. And now we are there are moments in time where the California grid is entirely renewables. And we are, like I said, doing development in red states. We're doing projects in West Virginia, and what were once the promises of clean jobs, I think, are bearing fruit. And so I think the takeaway is it's happening, and it's real. And that was not something that was a foregone conclusion 10 years ago at all. And so, and with the new bill and the momentum and all the great things that are happening, there's so much opportunity.
In 2007, we had a clean energy class at SOM, and there were 8 of us in the class. That should kind of frame how different things are.
There were 180 people in renewable energy project finance last semester.
Yeah.
Just to say.
Yeah. And the class was taught by like the former Secretary of Energy for the Philippines. Like there were 8 people in the class. Takeaways. I think selfishly, I would point to the structure really early in the value chain and the technology life cycle, and the appreciation that the tech stacks that are available today are not going to solve the decarbonization hurdles that we as a society have to get over in the next 2-3 decades. Which means that it's going to have to come from new ideas that are in gestation now, or haven't even been thought of yet. And for us to have a chance at success, we are not going to succeed by relying on wind alone, or on solar alone, or on hydrogen alone, or it's going to be a portfolio of a bunch of different solutions for a bunch of different scenarios, for a bunch of different market verticals, and a bunch of different geographies. And for that to happen, I think we have to appreciate that there's going to be complexity, and we need to figure out how do we make it easier for folks at Yale who have an idea and they want to run with it. That was not me. I think, I just think understanding that probably the big things that are going to help us along the way aren't in the ecosystem yet. So how do we tee those up and help encourage those and accelerate those and make space for those?
I think so. I did the joint degree between SOM and NYSE, and I think I graduated with like 15 credits of independent study. So for those of you that are students, 100% you should do it. Right now, we talked about the federal packages that are out there that we are all trying to separately navigate. If you are thinking about a career in this space, and if you are thinking about trying to demonstrate to a future employer that you can do something new, make yourself available to a nonprofit, a state agency, a startup, a for-profit. And in one of these spaces, we are all desperately trying to figure out what do these federal packages mean for us. That is a prime opportunity for you guys to go out and be like, hey, I am a grad student at Yale. I am a Yale College student. Would you like some free help to think about this project? And we will all say yes. And so as a great portfolio builder, we all need help. And honestly, we are very interested in figuring out how can we continue to pull in talent to our spaces. And so that would be my sort of takeaway is you might be equally an expert in some of these fields as we are because it's happening right now. And so, come in and pitch your services to us. Probably we'll say yes.
That's great.
I'm sorry, Stu. You're about to get a lot of will you supervise me requests.
I love that advice. I think clearly, one of the takeaways from last night, from the event today, is that there's really tremendous opportunities. It's really sort of exciting time to be a student in the space. And I think that's a really nice way to sort of think about like doing some tangible, getting experience, helping out, making a difference. Becky, can you hear us?
Hi, yes, I can.
So we are in the process of wrapping up the panel, but I wanted to give you a few moments to sort of talk about kind of the work you do at Avangrid. Tell us a little bit about sort of what's happening in offshore wind, especially around New England, and then sort of give us a few thoughts on that, and then we just had the other panelists kind of give a little sort of like some closing thoughts on sort of what they hope people take away from the conference today. So tell us a bit about offshore wind, and tell us sort of what your hope is for people take away from the event.
Okay, great. I'll skip the middle then. Becky Gallagher. I graduated with a joint degree from FES and SOM in 2016. And I TA'd all the renewable energy project finance related classes. So as a total energy nerd, feel free to email me if you ever want to connect. I'm always happy to have a conversation about project finance, about renewables. I worked at SunPower for 4 years doing DG solar project finance. Then I moved to Avangrid, where I did onshore project finance and offshore wind project finance. And then I burned out on the models a little bit, and now I'm full-time kind of external affairs, market entry for offshore wind. So Avangrid has a networks business, which is Berkshire Gas, United Illuminating, a bunch of utilities, and then we have a development business, which is split between on and offshore. So I'm on the offshore side. In offshore wind, Avangrid Renewables has the first ever commercial scale offshore wind project, which is Vineyard Wind, 800 megawatts, delivering into Barnstable, Massachusetts, and we're expecting first power next year, 2023. So super exciting time. We also have Park City Wind, Commonwealth Wind, and Kitty Hawk Wind in our offshore portfolio. And my team, which is new business, kind of manages all of the work on those projects up through PPA contract sign, and then we sort of kick it over to the execution side. So one thing that's been true in my renewable energy career is I've always been on the revenue line. I've always been on the early stage, the sales side, if you can call it that, or the market making, the policy side, which is kind of where I like to be. I think it's really exciting at the top of the funnel. So super exciting time in offshore wind. Auctions coming up of feels like every couple months now, auctioning off new seabed leased areas, which gives us more to sell on this sales team. And there's just a ton happening. It's kind of a hybrid of super heavy infrastructure, which has a big CapEx numbers, and a lot of kind of risk aversion, but then mixed with kind of a solar early stage technology excitement. So you have this hybrid or this kind of duality between being super forward lean and being super aggressive, but also carrying a ton of risk and wanting to be kind of as careful as you would be if you were building, the Brooklyn Bridge or something. If anyone's interested in offshore, I would just say, having done solar when 500 kW was a big deal, we have basically the same model for 2 gigawatt offshore wind project. The same core factors, the same core inputs drive value, whether you're talking about, a tiny resi solar system or a massive offshore wind project. A lot of the same pushes and pulls. So don't feel like, it's not accessible to you, or that, it's very different. It's actually a lot of the same themes. And we also have to think a lot about, what I heard on the tail end. I connected to audio late, but even like electrification and what folks on the panel were talking about. One cool thing about offshore wind is you have to kind of understand the market a little bit more, because you're impacting the market by injecting so much power. And so understanding markets that are going to electrify, market design is really important. I think even more so than in DG. So there's a lot of kind of intersections with offshore and the rest of the energy ecosystem. always happy to chat. Like I said, feel free to find me on LinkedIn, career changers or career renewable energy folks always enjoy geeking out. So feel free to reach out.
Thanks so much, Becky. So I think we have 2 or 3 minutes for a couple audience questions. We'll have to open it up. We have a microphone over here on the side. But yeah, anyone who has questions? Yes. Over here. Chase, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chase. Thank you so much for being here. This is a question for Jake or Becky or both of you. I'm so curious about the impacts of the IRA in terms of, Jake, you mentioned that like the 10-year PTC, ITC extension offers a lot of stability, which is very helpful. At the same time, y'all are in the business of, as you said, putting steel in the ground. And now is a time that some of those metals are experiencing really high inflationary pressures. I know that's having an impact. Becky, as far as I'm aware, y'all are currently looking at maybe a delay on Commonwealth that was potentially due to some of those, global supply chain issues. So what is the interaction between some of these new policy situations that are offering stability, but also kind of global economic pressures that are creating instability, and how are y'all navigating that?
Yeah, it's so challenging right now. We are getting so many headwinds, not only commodities, but interest rates, and also just like slot availability for the manufacturing slots. Just with the supply demand mismatch, vessel availability is super constrained right now. So whereas, it's challenging across the board. And I think when those trends began in about a year ago, people thought they would quickly regress to the mean. But what instead we've seen is kind of a secular rise in things like labor wages. They're never going to go down again. They're just up there, and the slot availability is just going to be constrained. And so that's what led us on Investor Day in mid-September to announce that we're going to extend the COD of Park City and Commonwealth Wind by 12 months each. So Park City is going to COD now in November of 27 and Commonwealth in November of 28. That also allows us to take advantage of next generation turbine technology, but it also hopefully find some relief, if possible, on these global commodities. It's super challenging. And then you have the IRA, which is positive and exciting and great, but we're really waiting on the guidance to come out. The guidance for the 40% ITC for domestic content for the VTGs and the kind of the other components is very much up in the air. There's a lot of question marks around what exactly counts as domestic steel and whether it's a standalone or a component part. That's going to make a big difference for us. And there's also just not that many domestic steel manufacturers that can make the type and the quantity of steel that we need for the monopiles and the turbines and the et cetera, the whole kind of tower. And then on the other side, you have transferability, which is kind of expanding access to the investment tax credit, which is great because that should finally reduce some of the premiums on tax equity. But we really don't know how that market is actually going to play out and what kind of benefits we're actually going to see in reductions in the cost of capital from the traditional tax equity investors, which we still may need because we need massive appetite for the ITC in offshore just because our capex is so high. So I think the bad stuff is kind of known and the good stuff is not going to be known for a while. And that's what the challenge is that we're kind of living right now and why we're paying for those extensions.
Yeah, and I would just add too that at a basic level, the gold standard for project finance is long contracted cash flow with an investment grade off-taker. So what the model has been is that, we need to put capital at risk to develop a project. And then at some point you sign a contract with an investment grade off-taker that locks in at a price that's locked in and at timing that's locked in. And what has happened over the last year or so, as Becky is experiencing, and we've experienced too, is like the world's changing and so fast that that contract that you locked in becomes a problem, and you need to, you have to have some really difficult discussions around that. So given the policy stability in the future, like I think maybe there could be a reimagining of that model. I hope there would be, actually, because maybe we don't have to contract the whole project with a long-term cash flow. Maybe we go merchant for part of it and actually see some upside, and rather than trying to kind of finance the project based on that's locked-in price that traditionally you've locked in at a pretty early stage in your development where things are still moving. Maybe that changes a little bit.
Let's do one more question. I think it was over here.
So thank you for the panel. This was great. I actually my name's Niall. I worked in the Connecticut governor's office before this, so I have a kind of policy. Oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you for the panel. I worked in the Connecticut governor's office before coming to SOM, and so I have a sort of policy-oriented question that's very similar to the past one that was asked. We have these Build in America provisions within the IRA. I think a lot of domestic manufacturers feel like their supply chains are pushed very thin right now, given the increased demand. I think we talked about the local power and onus that's on a lot of the states and municipalities after these funds are distributed. So I'm curious, this is kind of for all of you, but what should states be doing or local municipalities for that matter, be doing to really enable the manufacturing side at the local level when it comes to making sure that we're actually producing enough parts, et cetera, for these projects to actually get off the ground at the scale and speed that we need them to?
I don't know. We're talking about like local manufacturing, local jobs. I mean, I guess I'll just say from the state perspective, and I know we actually worked on this together while you were with the state office, is like it's so important that we make sure that there's workforce development programs to bring along people into this clean economy, because from the state's perspective, that is an essential part about doing this transition. It's not just that we have at this endpoint this clean future, it's that we build sustainable jobs throughout the process. So when I say sustainable jobs, I don't just mean jobs in the sustainable energy field. I mean jobs that are not just about the construction of those systems that might only last a year or two. It's about how do you build a career for somebody in this field.
I would add on to that. We're involved with a number of discussions with industrial operators in California who are looking to leave California because of the state's decarbonization objectives. That the push away from natural gas and to electrification is extreme enough where the operators are like, if I move all of my process heating over to electricity, given PG&E's electricity instability, and given the cost per kilowatt hour in California, I'm going to move to another state so I can get natural gas to keep running my process, and I know that natural gas is reliable and I can better forecast this future. So if we're talking about manufacturability of stuff on the ground, I think the implications there, it is absolutely workforce, it is absolutely permitting, but there are energy requirements associated with that manufacturing. And I think this kind of goes to the idea of, one of the beauties of this Clean Energy Conference is that I think for any of you that are interested in getting into the mix, there's so many different points to get plugged in and so many different issues that need to be resolved to make this clean energy economy actionable. And even if we just dive into that single question about how do we enable local manufacturing,
did you know that there's a tax credit in the IRA for clean energy manufacturing? Like if you make your manufacturing clean, or if you are manufacturing clean, like there's a tax credit there. I don't know what it means or how it's going to apply, but like it's in there.
There are so many opportunities to get involved,
Yeah.
and yeah, would really strongly encourage you to chase it.
Yeah.
So I think we are a few minutes over time, but thanks so much to all four of our panelists. I think this was a great way to kind of kick off what should be a fun and exciting day of sort of climate and energy conversation. So thanks again to all four of you. Really great to have you here. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.